So now let's think bigger. More games, more players. Because the limit to game theory is just in how much detail we put inside our models. And to demonstrate this, we're going to return to our prisoner's dilemma, except with an added twist. So instead of having just one round where players choose to confess or to stay silent, we will have multiple rounds. And what's key to note here is that across these multiple rounds, the players remember what happened in the previous rounds, and they can make decisions at this point according to the past. We could maybe see how this can make strategies a bit more complex, but we can demonstrate this by example. And so we have an example here where there's a guy and a girl, they get caught for a crime, and the guy decides to save his own skin, he decides to confess. Meanwhile, the girl decides to aim for mutual benefit and chooses to stay silent. Unfortunately, in this case, this backfires because she ends up stuck in jail for 10 years. But that's not the end of it. Let's say that 15 years later, they somehow end up getting caught again. Now, back in the interrogation room, the guy decides that, hey, she was silent last time. I can trust her, and so this time I will also stay silent. The girl, on the other hand, doesn't trust him as much, and so decides that she will confess and get her revenge because, regardless, at least that means because that means in the worst case she only has to go to prison for 5 years. And that's just an example of how strategies can evolve as we have multiple rounds. And there's three very commonly known strategies for the prisoner's dilemma, for the repeated prisoner's dilemma. One is the saint, the other is the devil, and the third is tit for tat. Now, the saint always chooses to stay silent regardless of what the other did. The devil always confesses, and it might sound weird because we're talking about a crime, but like the idea is the saint goes for mutual benefit, the devil goes for personal benefit. And tit for tat is a response based strategy where you start off by trusting, and then from there on, you just copy what the person did in the last move. So if the person stayed silent, then I'll continue staying silent. If the person confessed, then next round I will confess to sort of maintain a balance. Now we can see that if we pit these strategies against each other, what would happen? So for example, if we have a saint and a devil together, the devil will always take advantage of the saint's kindness and will always get away scot-free. If instead we had tit for tat against the devil, then the benefit there is that, okay, tit for tat trusts the first round, but from there on, we know better. We don't trust the devil. Alternatively, what happens when the saint and tit for tat work together? And what will happen really beautifully here is that they will reach a cooperative state where they're always consistently staying silent and getting mutual benefit. So that's awesome. But now let's add one more layer of complexity, replicator dynamics. Dynamics because these systems will evolve and change over time. So we live in a society, and the interesting thing about society is that there's many different players with many different personalities, dispositions, and most importantly for us, many different strategies. Now, what happens if we take these players and we start putting them against each other randomly? What would happen is that, based on who each person is paired up against, they will get a respective payoff. And what we'll see is that some strategies just generally end up with higher payoffs. For example, the saints, so in this case, where we have two saints, two devils, and two tit for tats, the saint gets kind of the short end of the stick because when he gets paired against the devil, he just gets completely obliterated. But the tit for tat, he manages well against the devil and he benefits a lot through the saint. And the devil does reasonably well against both as well. What ends up happening here is that the saint suffers and the saint might reduce in the population, whereas tit for tat, since it was benefiting, it would increase, and same with the devil. And we can see how systems can kind of evolve because this is a way we can model evolution where certain traits, if they guarantee better payoffs, will just thrive. And now let's try to put it into mathematical notation. It might be a lot of text, but we'll walk through it slowly. So let's call the three different strategies S1, S2, S3 for saint, devil, and tit for tat. We can denote the proportion of players using each strategy as P1, P2, and P3. So there's P1 people using S1 strategy, P2 people using S2 strategy, P3 people using S3 strategy. We can also denote the state of the population as sigma. State of the population basically meaning like the average strategy. It's really just shorthand for what we're about to write next, which is that we want to denote the average payoff of a specific strategy. The average payoff of that specific strategy is the payoff of the person using that strategy when he goes up against the average strategy of the population, which is sigma. Similarly, the overall average is just the payoff of using the average strategy against the average strategy. And from here, we can model the net benefit of a specific strategy as a benefit of that strategy minus the average the average payoff. Now from here, we can add one more assumption, is that as time progresses, the proportion of players adjust according to or proportional to the net benefit of the respective strategies. So if my strategy is better than average, then my proportion will increase, and if my strategy is worse than average, then it will decrease. And so formally we'd write this as a differential of the proportion of strategy I with respect to time equals to the net benefit of that strategy times the proportion of people that are already using that strategy. Because if there's more people already using it, then there's going to be more children in a sense if we talk about it in evolutionary terms. And this is a differential equation. It's a bit complex because these are functions themselves, and these functions depend on P1, P2, and P3, each of which have their own differential equations. And so these are a bit harder to solve, but they're definitely doable. But what's even better is that we can model them and we can try to simulate them using programs. And so I'd like to conclude by just showing a visual demonstration of how we could visualize this prisoner's dilemma. And this is some code I found on GitHub. But basically, we have a tournament where there's species Jesus, Lucifer, and tit for tat. Here, Jesus refers to saint, Lucifer refers to devil. Don't worry too much about that. And so what we do is we start a tournament with these players. Initially, each strategy has an equal proportion. As the rounds progress, the proportions adjust. And as we go further and further and further through the line as time progresses, we see that eventually the tit for tat strategy in this case takes over because it just has such good payoff. And we see that especially the Lucifer strategy declines. And that's because the Lucifer strategy only benefits, or the devil strategy benefits if there's a lot of saints. But it also discourages saints because it abuses them. And so it's kind of like a predator-prey situation. And then what eventually happens is that the devil strategy goes extinct. And so let's just finally wrap this up by ending the simulation. And we can get this nice little graph which shows to us how the proportions of each strategy varied with time.